The morning broke crisp and clear over the rolling hills of the national forest, sunlight filtering through the dense canopy in golden shafts. Early autumn had painted the wilderness in amber and crimson, a breathtaking tableau that changed subtly with each passing day. The air carried the earthy scent of fallen leaves and pine, mingling with the faint musk of soil still damp from the previous night's light rain. The hiker had risen before dawn, as was his custom for the past 15 years. At 47, his body still moved with the fluid efficiency that came from thousands of miles traversed across the varied terrains of the country's wilderness areas. His weathered face, etched with fine lines around the eyes, crow's feet earned from years of squinting against both summer sun and winter glare, maintained a perpetual expression of quiet observation. Those who knew him often remarked that he seemed to absorb the landscape rather than merely pass through it. This particular trail system had been his weekend sanctuary for nearly 2 decades, a place where the chaos of his weekday job as an environmental consultant faded into insignificance. Here, among the ancient trees and natural rhythms, he found the peace that eluded him since his divorce 11 years ago. His children, now in college on opposite coasts, understood their father's need for these solitary excursions. They had joined him occasionally during their younger years, learning to read topographical maps and identify edible plants, but these days his only companions were the contents of his meticulously packed backpack and the occasional fellow traveler on the trail. The hiker paused at a familiar vista point, removing his forest green cap to wipe a thin film of perspiration from his brow. His breathing was controlled, and even despite the moderate incline he had just conquered. From this elevation, he could see the misty valley below, the silver ribbon of a stream winding through stands of maple and oak. In the distance, the peaks of the mountain range formed a jagged horizon against the cerulean sky. He took a long pull from his water bottle, savoring the cool liquid. Something felt different today. The hiker couldn't quite place it, but years of wilderness experience had honed his senses to detect subtle variations in his environment. The birds were less vocal than usual for this time of morning. A family of deer he often spotted in this area was notably absent. The forest possessed an unnatural stillness that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up, a primitive warning system triggering without clear cause. He consulted his GPS device, confirming his location on the familiar trail. The main path would loop around for another 7 miles before returning to the parking area where his trusty Subaru waited. According to his device, there was a lesser-used trail, more of a game path really, that cut through a section of forest he'd never explored. It would shave at least 2 hours off his hike, which would be welcome today. The strange atmosphere had diminished his usual enthusiasm, and dark clouds gathering on the distant horizon suggested an approaching weather system not forecasted in the morning report. Might be wise to get ahead of that, the hiker murmured to himself, his voice sounding unusually loud in the quiet forest. Decision made, he adjusted his pack and turned toward the less traveled path. The trail immediately narrowed, becoming little more than a suggestion of passage through increasingly dense undergrowth. Fallen logs and exposed roots created natural obstacles that required careful navigation. The canopy thickened overhead, casting the forest floor in deepening shadow despite the morning hour. The hiker moved with practiced efficiency, each step deliberate and testing for stability before committing his weight. His mind wandered to the report he needed to complete for Monday's meeting, mentally organizing his findings on watershed contamination in the region. The work was important but often frustrating, with corporate interests frequently overshadowing environmental concerns, despite his meticulous documentation. A sudden crack, like a branch snapping underfoot, broke his reverie. The hiker froze, instinctively crouching lower. He listened intently, eyes scanning the surrounding vegetation. After 30 seconds of complete silence, he straightened slowly. Probably just a deer, he thought, though he couldn't shake the sensation of being observed. The forest had grown uncommonly quiet. No birdsong, no rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, just the soft whisper of leaves stirred by an occasional breeze. The temperature seemed to have dropped several degrees, though the hiker couldn't determine if this was an actual change or merely his perception. He zipped his lightweight jacket higher and continued forward, his pace quickening subtly. The path began to descend into a shallow ravine, not marked on his map. The vegetation changed character, becoming sparser but older. Massive trees with trunks wider than his arm span dominated this section, their roots creating a natural staircase down the gentle slope. Moss covered much of the ground and lower tree trunks, glowing with an almost luminescent green in the filtered light. At the bottom of the ravine, the hiker paused again. A stream trickled through the center, barely 2 feet wide but clear and swift-moving. He knelt to refill his water bottle, applying a purification tablet as a precaution. As the tablet dissolved, he surveyed his surroundings with growing unease. This section of forest felt untouched, almost primeval in its isolation. Beautiful, certainly, but with an underlying sense of wrongness he couldn't articulate. Rising to continue his journey, the hiker noticed a peculiar arrangement of stones near the stream's edge, too regular to be natural, too weathered to be recent. He approached cautiously, crouching to examine what appeared to be a crude circle of river rocks, each roughly the size of his fist. In the center lay a smaller stone of different composition, not local to this ecosystem based on his geological knowledge. He resisted the urge to touch it, instead photographing the arrangement with his phone. The shortcut, if it could still be called that, continued up the opposite side of the ravine. The hiker shouldered his pack and began the ascent, finding himself breathing harder than the moderate climb warranted. The air felt heavier here, almost resistant to his passage. The strange silence persisted, broken only by his footfalls and increasingly deliberate breathing. Cresting the ravine, the hiker emerged into an unexpected clearing, roughly circular and approximately 50 yards in diameter. He checked his GPS again, confirming that this feature wasn't marked on any of his maps. The clearing appeared unnatural, too perfectly shaped, the ground too level. Tall grass covered most of the open space, but it grew in an unusual pattern, forming concentric circles visible only when viewed from the slight elevation where he stood. The hiker's pulse quickened as he scanned the clearing methodically. His years of wilderness experience offered no explanation for what he was seeing. The strange formations, the unnatural silence, the odd atmospheric pressure, all suggested something beyond normal forest phenomena. He was about to skirt the edge of the clearing when a metallic glint caught his eye, something reflective partially concealed in the tall grass near the center of the space. Against his better judgment, curiosity and professional habit compelled him forward. Each step through the grass felt wrong somehow, as though he were trespassing in a space not meant for human intrusion. As he approached the center, the hiker's breathing became shallow, his heart hammering against his ribs. What he initially thought might be a lost piece of hiking equipment or trash revealed itself to be something far more incongruous with the wilderness setting. There, partially buried in the soil but clearly exposed by recent rainfall, was what appeared to be a metallic hatch or door, approximately 3 feet in diameter. Its surface, though tarnished by exposure, reflected the morning light in a dull silver sheen. Around its circumference, unusual symbols or characters were etched in a pattern the hiker had never encountered in his extensive studies of indigenous cultures or archaeological findings. The hiker stood motionless, staring down at the object with a mixture of disbelief and mounting alarm. His mind raced through possible explanations: military installation, scientific research equipment, elaborate prank, but none seemed to fit the remote location or the apparent age of the object. The edge of the metal disc showed significant corrosion and was partially overgrown with moss, suggesting it had been here for years, possibly decades. "What the hell?" he whispered, his voice barely audible even to himself. Kneeling beside the object, the hiker noticed that the ground around it was different, harder, almost crystallized compared to the surrounding soil. He reached out hesitantly, then pulled his hand back before making contact. Something about the object triggered a primal warning in his mind, an instinctive caution that overrode his scientific curiosity. Instead, he unshouldered his pack and retrieved his phone, carefully photographing the disc and its surroundings from multiple angles. He included his hiking boot in one shot for scale reference. The metal appeared seamless except for a circular indentation near what he presumed was the top edge, possibly a handle or opening mechanism. The strange symbols continued in a spiral pattern toward the center of the disc. As he documented the discovery, the hiker noticed something else. The grass around the metal disc was growing in an unusual pattern, leaning away from the object as if repelled. Furthermore, there were no insects or small organisms visible in the immediate vicinity of the disc, despite the otherwise teeming ecosystem of the forest floor. The hiker's training as an environmental consultant kicked in, and he began a more methodical examination. He recorded notes into his phone's voice memo app, describing the object's dimensions, apparent composition, and the anomalous conditions surrounding it. He collected soil samples from varying distances from the disc, carefully sealing them in sample bags from his kit. Possible contamination site, he noted, though the description felt inadequate. Unknown metallic object approximately 3 feet in diameter, partially embedded in clearing soil. No visible opening mechanism. Unusual script or symbols around perimeter. Surrounding vegetation shows atypical growth patterns. Complete absence of insect activity within approximately 2-foot radius of object. He checked the time, surprised to find that nearly an hour had passed since he'd entered the clearing. The darkening sky suggested the approaching weather system was moving faster than anticipated. He needed to make a decision: continue documenting this unprecedented discovery or resume his hike to avoid being caught in a potential storm. Professional interest won out over caution. The hiker completed his documentation, including precise GPS coordinates of the location. As he prepared to leave, a sudden impulse compelled him to reach out and touch the metal surface. The moment his fingertips contacted the disc, a sensation like static electricity jolted through his hand. It wasn't painful exactly, but intensely uncomfortable, a vibration that seemed to resonate with his bone structure rather than his skin. He jerked his hand back immediately, heart racing with renewed alarm. More disturbing was what happened to the disc itself. At his touch, the strange symbols had briefly illuminated with a pale blue light, fading almost immediately but leaving a distinct afterimage in his vision. The ground beneath his feet had trembled slightly, a vibration so subtle he might have imagined it if not for the ripples in a small puddle nearby. The hiker stumbled backward, nearly falling in his haste to put distance between himself and the object. Thunder rumbled in the distance, as if nature itself were responding to the disturbance. "This is beyond my expertise," he said aloud, voice unsteady. His scientific mind struggled to process what his senses were reporting. With growing urgency, the hiker repacked his samples and equipment. The darkening sky and increasingly gusty wind suggested the storm would arrive sooner than expected. He needed to report this discovery, but to whom? The Park Service seemed the logical first step, though he suspected this might quickly escalate beyond their jurisdiction. He marked a waypoint on his GPS and began retracing his steps toward the main trail, moving with greater speed than caution warranted. Twice he nearly lost his footing on the descent back into the ravine. The forest seemed different on the return journey, the silence more oppressive, the shadows deeper despite the approaching noon hour. By the time the hiker reached his vehicle, large raindrops had begun to fall, patterning the dusty surface of the parking area. He stowed his equipment methodically despite his agitation, professional habits overriding his desire to flee. Only when secured in the driver's seat did he allow himself to review the photos he'd taken. The images were clear enough. The metallic disc, the strange symbols, the anomalous vegetation patterns. Yet somehow they failed to capture the profound wrongness of the sight, the atmospheric pressure, the unnatural silence. The hiker forwarded the images and his voice notes to his personal email as a backup, then started the engine. The ranger station was located approximately 5 miles from the trailhead, a small but well-maintained facility that served as the administrative center for this section of the national forest. The hiker had interacted with the staff there occasionally over the years, usually to report trail maintenance issues or wildlife sightings of interest. He parked in the nearly empty lot, unsurprising given the rapidly deteriorating weather, and gathered his phone and sample kit before making a dash through the intensifying rain to the station's covered entrance. Inside, the familiar scent of pine disinfectant and coffee created an incongruously normal atmosphere after his morning's discovery. A single ranger sat behind the reception desk, a woman in her late 30s whom the hiker recognized from previous visits but whose name escaped him. "Rough day for hiking," she commented, glancing up from her computer. "You get caught in this downpour?" "Just the beginning of it," the hiker replied, trying to keep his voice casual despite his internal agitation. "I need to report something unusual I found on the North Trail system." The ranger's expression shifted subtly from casual welcome to professional interest. "What kind of unusual? Wildlife, trail damage, unauthorized camping?" "None of those." The hiker hesitated, suddenly aware of how his discovery might sound. "I found what appears to be some kind of metal structure or hatch, partially buried in a clearing about 4 miles from the Oak Ridge trailhead. It's not on any of the maps, and I've never seen anything like it before." The ranger's expression remained neutral, though her eyes narrowed slightly. "Metal structure? Like an old hunting blind or research equipment?" "No." The hiker set his phone on the counter, pulling up the clearest image of the disc. Like this. The ranger studied the photo, her professional demeanor unchanged. Looks like you might have found an old survey marker, or possibly part of a weather monitoring station. The research university sets those up sometimes with our permission. The hiker shook his head. This is 3 feet across, partially buried, with symbols I've never seen before. And when I touched it, he stopped, reconsidering how to describe the experience without sounding delusional. The surrounding vegetation is affected. I took soil samples. There's something not right about it. The ranger's expression had shifted from interest to polite skepticism. I appreciate you bringing this to our attention, sir. I'll log it in our system and have one of our resource management specialists take a look when they can. Would you mind emailing me those photos? The bureaucratic response both frustrated and relieved the hiker. Part of him had hoped for immediate action, a team of experts rushing to investigate. Another part was grateful for the normalcy of the interaction, a counterbalance to the strangeness of his experience. Of course, he said, taking the business card she offered. I've documented the exact GPS coordinates. I'd be willing to guide someone back to the location if needed. That's very helpful, the ranger replied, her tone making it clear she considered the matter routine and a low priority. We'll be in touch if our specialists have any questions. The hiker lingered, wanting to emphasize the significance of his discovery, but lacking the vocabulary to convey its profound strangeness. Finally, he simply nodded, tucking the business card into his pocket. Is there anything else I can help you with today? The ranger asked, clearly ready to return to her previous tasks. No, that's all. The hiker turned to leave, then paused. You might want to restrict access to that section of trail until someone investigates. Just as a precaution. The ranger's smile remained professional, but had cooled noticeably. I'll make a note of your recommendation, sir. Drive safely. The weather report says this storm might intensify through the evening. Outside, the rain had increased to a steady downpour. The hiker dashed to his vehicle, his mind still processing the ranger's dismissive response. He understood it, in a way. They likely received dozens of unusual reports each month from hikers misidentifying natural phenomena or discovering mundane objects with perfectly reasonable explanations. But what he'd found was different. He knew it with a certainty that transcended his scientific training and professional experience. The disc, the symbols, the strange environmental effects, they represented something significant, possibly dangerous. As he drove through the worsening storm toward home, the hiker's thoughts raced. The Park Service clearly wouldn't prioritize his discovery. Should he contact the EPA, the university's archaeology department, local law enforcement? None seemed entirely appropriate, and all would likely respond with the same bureaucratic inertia. By the time he arrived home, darkness had fallen, the storm lashing his modest suburban house with wind-driven rain. He transferred his samples to his home office, alongside the detailed notes he'd compiled during the drive. The photos, when viewed on his larger computer monitor, remained clear but somehow inadequate, failing to capture the essential wrongness of the site. Sleep proved elusive that night. Every time the hiker closed his eyes, he saw the strange symbols illuminated with that eerie blue light. His fingers still retained a phantom sensation from touching the disc, a subtle vibration that seemed to have embedded itself in his bones. Around 3 in the morning, he gave up on rest and returned to his office. If the authorities wouldn't take immediate action, he would need to investigate further himself. His environmental consulting background gave him access to testing equipment and analytical resources not available to the average citizen. He began compiling a list of what he would need for a proper investigation: soil testing kits, radiation detector, metal sampling tools, better photographic equipment, perhaps ground-penetrating radar if he could borrow it from a colleague in the Geological Survey Department. Tomorrow, no, today, he corrected, noting the early hour. He would begin making calls, pulling in professional favors, gathering the resources needed to understand what lay buried in that perfect clearing. The rational part of his mind suggested he was overreacting, that there was likely a mundane explanation for what he'd found. But deeper instincts, the same ones that had kept him safe through decades of wilderness exploration, insisted otherwise. Something profound waited in those woods, something that might explain the strange silence, the absence of wildlife, the unnatural perfection of the clearing, something that had remained hidden until he, by chance or design, had taken that shortcut through the woods. Morning arrived with lingering rain and leaden skies. the storm having settled into a persistent drizzle that promised to continue through the day. The hiker, bleary-eyed from his sleepless night, stood before his bathroom mirror, assessing the haggard face that stared back at him. The events of the previous day seemed almost dreamlike in the harsh fluorescent light, yet the soil samples lined up on his home office desk provided tangible evidence of his discovery. After 2 cups of strong coffee, he placed a call to a colleague at the university's environmental science department, carefully framing his request as a professional courtesy rather than an urgent investigation. "Just need access to the lab for some soil analysis," he explained, keeping his tone casual. "Potential contamination site I stumbled across during a recreational hike." The colleague agreed without much questioning, accustomed to the hiker's meticulous approach to his environmental consulting work. With that arrangement secured for the afternoon, the hiker turned his attention to the historical context of his discovery. The County Historical Society maintained an extensive archive in the basement of the public library, a resource he had utilized occasionally for environmental impact assessments involving older industrial sites. If the metal structure had been present in the forest for decades, as its condition suggested, there might be historical records that could provide context. The library stood in the center of town, a century-old stone building that had been expanded multiple times over the decades, creating an architectural patchwork that somehow maintained its dignified presence. The rain had thinned the usual crowd of visitors, leaving the main floor eerily quiet as the hiker made his way to the reference desk. The archivist, a woman in her 60s with silver-rimmed glasses perched on her nose, recognized him from his previous research visits. "Back again so soon?" she asked, marking her place in a massive ledger with an acid-free bookmark. "I thought your watershed report was completed last month." "This is something different," the hiker replied, lowering his voice instinctively despite the nearly empty room. "I'm researching the northern section of the National Forest, specifically about 4 miles from the Oak Ridge trailhead. I'm interested in any historical structures, installations, or unusual events in that area." The archivist's expression remained neutral, but her eyes sharpened with interest. "That's quite a remote section. Any particular time period you're focusing on?" "Mid-20th century, potentially," the hiker estimated based on the weathering of the metal disc, though earlier records would be helpful too. "Let me see what we have." She led him through the reference area to a door marked Archives, Staff, and Authorized Researchers Only. Behind it, a flight of stairs descended into the library's basement level, where climate-controlled rooms housed the county's historical documents. "We've been digitizing the collection for the past 5 years, the archivist explained as they walked, but the older material and less requested items are still only available in physical form. The forest area you're interested in falls under several possible categories: military records, conservation establishment, geological surveys." They entered a room lined with metal shelving units containing acid-free boxes and document cases. A central table equipped with white cotton gloves and document weights indicated the workspace for examining fragile materials. "Start with these," the archivist suggested, retrieving several boxes from different shelves. Land surveys from the 1930s, when the national forest boundaries were established, geological reports from various decades, and a section of newspaper archives covering unusual events in the region. "I'll pull the military records separately. They're stored in another section." The hiker thanked her and settled at the table, pulling on the required gloves before carefully opening the first box of survey documents. Hours passed as he methodically worked through decades of reports, maps, and newspaper clippings, creating a timeline of the forest's documented history. The surveys showed no structures or installations near his GPS coordinates, but he noted something curious. A section approximately half a mile square around the location appeared consistently blank or minimally detailed across multiple decades of mapping. Not obviously redacted or censored, but rather lacking the detailed topographical markings that characterized the surrounding areas. By mid-morning, he had assembled a small collection of potentially relevant documents, including a geological survey from 1952 that noted anomalous magnetic readings in a section that roughly corresponded to his discovery site, with a recommendation for further investigation that appeared to have never been conducted. A series of local newspaper articles from 1958 reporting unusual lights seen over the forest for 3 consecutive nights, dismissed by authorities as weather phenomena despite dozens of witness accounts. a land use restriction filing from 1961 designating a section of the forest as temporarily closed for unspecified resource management activities, sponsored by a federal department whose acronym he didn't recognize. Most intriguing was a thin file containing internal correspondence between the Forest Service and what appeared to be a military research division, dating from 1963-1967. The heavily redacted documents mentioned a containment structure and ongoing monitoring requirement, though specific locations and details had been obscured. Finding what you need? The archivist had returned with another box, this one smaller and marked with a faded government classification sticker. Possibly, the hiker replied, gesturing to his organized piles. There seems to be a gap in the record, though. Something was happening in that section of forest in the 1950s and 60s, but the details are sparse. The archivist set down the new box with unusual care. This might help fill some gaps. It was declassified in the late 90s but wasn't properly integrated into our catalog until our recent digitization project, Military Installations in the Region, 1945-1970. The hiker opened the box with heightened interest. Inside were facility maps, personnel rosters, names still redacted, and operational reports for various installations throughout the county. Most were mundane: communications outposts, training areas, equipment storage facilities, but one folder labeled Project Elmwood caught his attention. The folder contained sparse documentation of a research facility established in 1954, approximately 3 miles from his discovery site. The exact nature of the research was never explicitly stated, with references only to atmospheric monitoring and subterranean anomaly assessment. A grainy black and white photograph showed a concrete bunker-like structure partially built into a hillside, surrounded by security fencing. Most telling was a facility decommissioning report dated October 1967, noting that while surface structures had been removed and the site restored to natural appearance, the primary containment structure remains in situ per Protocol XR7, with perpetual monitoring requirements transferred to civilian oversight agencies. The hiker photographed the documents with his phone, careful to include reference numbers and filing codes for potential follow-up. The archivist, who had been assisting another researcher, returned as he was repacking the boxes. "Find anything illuminating?" she asked, a hint of genuine curiosity in her tone. "Maybe," the hiker responded cautiously. "Do you know anything about a facility called Project Elmwood, or somewhere called Bunker 7? The archivist's expression shifted subtly, a flicker of recognition quickly masked by professional neutrality. "The name sounds vaguely familiar, but we have so many documents." She hesitated, then added in a lower voice, "You might want to speak with the retired Forest Service supervisor. He volunteers at the Historical Society Museum on Thursdays. If anyone knows about old structures in the forest, it would be him." The Historical Society Museum occupied a former bank building on the town's main street, its imposing facade and granite steps lending it an air of official importance despite its modest size. The hiker arrived shortly after lunch, having spent the intervening hour reviewing his morning's discoveries at a nearby cafe. The museum's interior was typical of small-town historical institutions: glass cases displaying artifacts of local significance, faded photographs of founding families, and dioramas depicting indigenous settlements and early industry. A single visitor, an elderly woman studying a textile display, and a bored-looking teenage attendant at the gift shop were the only other occupants. "I'm looking for the retired Forest Service supervisor," the hiker explained to the young attendant. The archivist at the library mentioned he volunteers here on Thursdays. "Oh, he's in the back archive room," the teenager replied, pointing toward a doorway partially hidden behind a display of mining equipment. "Just knock first. He doesn't like being startled." The hiker followed the directions, rapping gently on the wooden door. A gruff voice called for him to enter. Inside, a small office space had been converted to a document processing area, with a large table covered in photographs being sorted into archival sleeves. The retired supervisor, a man in his 70s with a full white beard and the weathered complexion of someone who had spent decades outdoors, looked up from his work with an expression of mild annoyance. "Museum's closed for inventory in this section," he stated flatly. "I'm not here for the museum exhibits," the hiker clarified. "The archivist at the library suggested you might be able to help with some historical information about the National Forest." specifically about a facility called Project Elmwood or Bunker 7. The change in the older man's demeanor was immediate and pronounced. His back stiffened, and he carefully set down the photograph he'd been holding, removing his gloves with deliberate movements. "Who's asking?" he demanded, eyes narrowing. The hiker introduced himself by profession, explaining his discovery in the forest and the subsequent research. As he spoke, the retired supervisor's expression shifted between skepticism and growing concern. "Sit down," he finally said, gesturing to a spare chair. He moved to close the office door before returning to his seat. That section of forest has a complicated history. Most of it never made it into official records, and what did was sanitized to the point of uselessness. Over the next hour, the retired supervisor filled in crucial gaps in the historical record. Project Elmwood, he explained, had been established following reports of unusual geological phenomena in the area in the early 1950s. They called it a research station, but it was really a monitoring facility, he said, his voice carrying the weight of long-held secrets. "I was just a junior ranger when they decommissioned the surface buildings in '67, but I was involved in the quarterly inspections for years afterward, until they phased out the program in the late '80s. "Inspections of what?" the hiker pressed. The retired supervisor hesitated, conflict evident in his expression. "They never told us exactly. The protocol was to hike to specified coordinates, check that certain markers remained in place, and record any unusual conditions, vegetation changes, wildlife behavior, that sort of thing. The reports went to some department in Washington. After a few years, the inspections were reduced to annual, then eventually discontinued entirely. And Bunker 7? Was that related? That was the designation for the underground portion of the facility. The surface buildings were removed, but according to the briefings I received, the subterranean structure was too integrated to be safely removed. So they sealed it and established the monitoring program." The hiker showed the retired supervisor the photographs of the metal disc he'd discovered. The older man's hands trembled slightly as he examined the images. "This isn't one of the monitoring markers," he said finally. "Those were just concrete posts with survey plates. This is something else entirely, something they didn't tell us about." He looked up, his expression grave. "Where exactly did you find this?" The hiker hesitated, suddenly reluctant to share the precise location, an instinctive caution he couldn't fully explain. He gave coordinates approximately half a mile from the actual site. The retired supervisor frowned. "That can't be right. That would put it outside the containment perimeter." "Containment of what?" the hiker asked. The older man shook his head. "They never said explicitly. The briefing documents referred to geological instability and atmospheric research, but the security protocols were extreme for something so benign, and there were rumors among the longer-serving rangers." He trailed off, seemingly reconsidering his words. "What kind of rumors?" "Equipment malfunctions in that sector, unusual wildlife behavior, rangers requesting transfers after solo inspections. Nothing concrete, nothing you could point to as definitive. Just a persistent sense that something wasn't right in that part of the forest." He studied the hiker's face. "You felt it too, didn't you, when you were there?" The hiker nodded slowly, remembering the unnatural silence, the absence of wildlife, the strange atmospheric pressure. "The thing is," the retired supervisor continued, "the inspection protocol stopped nearly 30 years ago. Whatever they were monitoring, they either decided it was no longer a concern, or someone decided to stop paying attention," the hiker finished. "Either way, you should report this to federal authorities, not the local ranger station. This is beyond their jurisdiction. Could you help with that, given your history with the site?" The retired supervisor shook his head emphatically. "I'm long retired, and I signed security agreements that technically still apply. But I can point you toward someone who might take an interest." He scribbled a name and number on a museum notepad. "Environmental Protection Division, Region 8. Ask for the Resource Protection Coordinator. Don't mention my name, but reference the Project Elmwood monitoring protocols." The hiker pocketed the contact information and thanked the retired supervisor, who seemed eager to conclude their conversation. As he rose to leave, the older man spoke again, his voice lower and more urgent. "One more thing. The monitoring teams always operated in pairs, minimum. No one ever went to that site alone. There was a reason for that protocol." The cryptic warning followed the hiker as he exited the museum into renewed rainfall. The afternoon was advancing, and he still planned to analyze his soil samples at the university laboratory. Despite the valuable historical context he'd uncovered, he felt no closer to understanding what he'd actually found in the forest clearing. The university's environmental science building stood on the north edge of campus, a modern glass and concrete structure that contrasted sharply with the historical architecture of the main quadrangle. The hiker's colleague, an associate professor of environmental chemistry, met him in the lobby and escorted him to a basement laboratory equipped for soil analysis. "You've got 2 hours before the evening lab session," the colleague explained, swiping his access card to unlock the equipment room. "Should be enough time for preliminary testing. What exactly are we looking for?" "I'm not entirely sure," the hiker admitted. "Unusual chemical composition, radiation, heavy metals, anything that might explain vegetation abnormalities." His colleague raised an eyebrow but asked no further questions, instead demonstrating the operation of several testing devices before leaving to attend a departmental meeting. Alone in the lab, the hiker methodically processed his samples, starting with basic composition analysis and progressing to more specialized tests. The results were puzzling rather than enlightening. The soil samples taken nearest to the metal disc showed several anomalies. Trace elements that didn't match the regional geological profile, including unusual concentrations of rare earth metals. Microscopic crystalline structures in the soil that resembled industrial byproducts, but didn't match any standard reference samples. Most concerning, soil bacteria counts that decreased progressively in samples closer to the disc, with almost complete microbial sterility in the sample taken directly adjacent to the metal surface. The hiker documented his findings meticulously, though their significance remained unclear. Whatever the metal disc was, its presence was actively affecting the surrounding ecosystem in ways that seemed harmful rather than merely unusual. As he was completing his analysis, his phone vibrated with an incoming text message from an unknown number. "Stop asking questions about Elmwood." The hiker stared at the message, a cold weight settling in his stomach. He had spoken to exactly 2 people about Project Elmwood, the archivist and the retired supervisor, and had only left the museum 3 hours earlier. The speed with which someone had identified his interest and obtained his personal phone number was deeply unsettling. He finished packing the equipment with hands that weren't entirely steady, then transferred his data to a secure cloud storage location and a USB drive he placed in his pocket. As an afterthought, he took photographs of each soil sample and the raw testing data displayed on the laboratory monitors. The university parking garage was nearly empty when he returned to his vehicle, most faculty and students having departed for the evening. As he approached his Subaru, he immediately noticed something was wrong. The driver's side window was intact, the door still locked, but a white envelope had been placed beneath the windshield wiper. The hiker glanced around the deserted garage level before retrieving the envelope with a tissue to preserve potential fingerprints. Inside was a single sheet of plain white paper bearing a typed message. "The site is restricted. Surrender all collected samples and data. This is your only warning. No signature, no contact information, nothing to indicate who had left the message or how they expected him to comply with their demand." The hiker's heart rate accelerated as the implications sank in. Someone was watching him, tracking his movements and research with alarming efficiency. He started his vehicle and pulled out of the parking garage, checking his rearview mirror frequently for signs of surveillance. The rational part of his mind suggested contacting law enforcement to report the threatening message, but a deeper instinct cautioned against it, until he understood what he was dealing with and who was issuing the threats. Official channels might expose him to greater risk rather than providing protection. Instead, he drove to an electronics store in a neighboring town, purchasing a prepaid mobile phone with cash. From the store parking lot, he called the number the retired supervisor had provided. His own phone powered off and stowed in a signal-blocking pouch he used for wilderness trips. The call connected after 4 rings. "Environmental Protection Division, Resource Management," a female voice answered. "I need to speak with the Resource Protection Coordinator," the hiker stated, keeping his voice low despite being alone in his vehicle. "It's regarding the Project Elmwood monitoring protocols." A long pause followed. "That's a dormant classification," the voice finally replied, her tone notably more formal. "May I ask who's calling?" The hiker identified himself by profession only, briefly describing his discovery in the National Forest and the threatening messages he'd received. The retired Forest Service supervisor suggested your office might have jurisdiction. "I'm going to transfer you," the woman replied after another pause. "Please hold." Several minutes passed before a new voice came on the line, male and authoritative. This is the regional coordinator. I understand you've encountered something related to Project Elmwood. The hiker provided a concise summary of his discovery and subsequent research, including the soil analysis results and the warnings he'd received. Your location right now? The coordinator asked when he had finished. The hiker hesitated, the morning's events having eroded his trust in official channels. Is that necessary information at this stage? If you want protection, yes. The coordinator's tone was matter-of-fact. Based on what you've described, you've stumbled into something with significant security implications. The warnings you've received suggest others are already aware of your discovery and consider you a problem. Who are they? The hiker pressed. Military, intelligence agencies? That's complicated, the coordinator replied after a brief hesitation. Project Elmwood was a joint operation with a complex oversight structure. Some elements were officially discontinued, but others may have continued under different authorities. What matters now is securing the site and ensuring your safety. And the environmental implications? My soil samples show significant contamination. That will be addressed as part of the containment protocol. The coordinator's voice had taken on an impatient edge. Now, I need your current location to dispatch a security team and the precise coordinates of your discovery. Something in the coordinator's tone triggered the hiker's caution. The rapid escalation to security teams and containment protocols seemed disproportionate to the information he'd shared. The emphasis on his location rather than the details of his discovery struck him as misplaced priority. I'll need to call you back, the hiker said abruptly. I want to verify your department's involvement in the original project. That would be unwise, the coordinator began, but the hiker had already ended the call. His instincts screamed danger, though from what direction he couldn't determine. The original threat had warned him to stop asking questions, but the supposed federal coordinator had seemed equally focused on locating him and the discovery site, rather than understanding what he'd found. As darkness fell, the hiker sat in his vehicle in the shopping center parking lot, weighing his options. The prepaid phone lay silent on the passenger seat, its screen reflecting the intermittent glow of passing headlights. He needed allies, information, and protection, not necessarily in that order. He thought of the environmental journalist he'd worked with on a watershed contamination story the previous year. Someone with resources, contacts in federal agencies, and no direct connection to local power structures. Someone who understood the value of discretion and the techniques of investigation. Decision made, the hiker started his vehicle and pulled back onto the main road, his destination now clear. Whatever he had discovered in that forest clearing, whatever Project Elmwood had been designed to contain, the truth needed to emerge through channels he could trust. Behind him, unnoticed in the growing darkness, a black SUV with tinted windows pulled out of the shopping center lot, maintaining a careful distance as it followed. Dawn broke with unusual clarity after days of persistent rain, the rising sun casting long shadows across the hiker's living room, where maps, printouts, and research materials covered every available surface. He hadn't truly slept in the 48 hours since discovering the metal disc in the forest clearing, only managing brief periods of restless unconsciousness as his mind processed the accelerating events. The environmental journalist had responded to his message with unexpected urgency, arranging to meet him later that evening at a busy restaurant in a neighboring city. Public places only, she had insisted in her terse reply. Bring everything you've gathered. Say nothing over phone or email. The hiker's movements around his home had become methodical, paranoid. He kept the blinds drawn, avoided silhouetting himself against windows, and periodically checked outside for unfamiliar vehicles. The black SUV he'd spotted following him from the shopping center had disappeared during his evasive driving through residential neighborhoods, but the sensation of being watched had persisted. On his dining table lay the equipment he'd gathered for a final return to the forest site. His standard hiking gear supplemented with additional documentation tools, including a high-resolution camera with night vision capability borrowed from his office, a handheld GPS unit with satellite uplink, and a radiation detector purchased online with cash and picked up from a specialty electronics store 2 towns away. More concerning was the compact 9mm handgun positioned beside the backpack, a firearm he'd owned for years but rarely touched, kept primarily for protection during remote field assignments in areas with dangerous wildlife. The decision to bring it reflected his escalating assessment of human, rather than animal threat. At his computer, the hiker recorded a video, speaking directly to the camera in measured tones despite his exhaustion. "I'm recording this as insurance," he began, voice steady. If you're viewing this, I failed to return from my investigation of the anomalous structure in the northern section of the National Forest. All my research materials are organized in the folders on this desk. Soil samples are in the refrigerator, labeled and dated. GPS coordinates for the site are recorded in my field notebook. He detailed his discoveries chronologically, from the initial finding of the metal disc to the historical research at the library and conversations with the retired supervisor. He described the threatening messages, the apparent surveillance, and his growing suspicion that official channels had been compromised. I believe what I've discovered represents either an environmental hazard that has been deliberately concealed from the public or something more significant that certain parties are willing to threaten violence to keep secret. Either scenario warrants full disclosure regardless of classification status or historical security protocols. The hiker saved the video to multiple storage devices, a cloud account under an alias, a USB drive hidden in a kitchen cabinet, and one that would remain with him. He then composed a detailed email to his sister, a corporate attorney living 3 states away, programming it to send automatically if he didn't enter a cancellation code within 36 hours. The message included access information for all his documentation and a request to pursue legal and media channels if he disappeared. By mid-morning, his preparations were complete. The hiker moved his vehicle to a shopping mall parking structure 15 miles from the forest entrance, positioning it strategically near security cameras but away from primary traffic lanes. From there, he called a rideshare service using his prepaid phone, directing the driver to drop him at a trailhead 2 miles south of his actual destination, a precaution against creating records of his precise movements. The forest welcomed him with deceptive tranquility. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, creating dappled patterns on the leaf-strewn path. Birds called from the branches above, their activities seemingly normal in this section of the wilderness. Only as he approached the ravine marking the boundary of the affected area did the unnatural silence begin to descend, the gradual disappearance of wildlife creating an invisible barrier between ordinary forest and something other. The hiker moved with heightened awareness, every sense attuned to his surroundings. He followed a circuitous route to the clearing, avoiding the direct path he'd taken days earlier, pausing frequently to listen and observe. The radiation detector in his hand registered only background levels, its quiet operation providing minimal reassurance. When he finally reached the edge of the circular clearing, he remained within the tree line, conducting a careful survey with binoculars before proceeding. The clearing appeared unchanged at first glance. The same perfectly circular shape, the unusual vegetation patterns, the metallic disc partially embedded near the center. But as he observed more carefully, subtle differences emerged. The grass immediately surrounding the disc had yellowed in the intervening days, forming a widening circle of decay. More concerning were the fresh footprints visible in the soft earth, multiple sets indicating at least 3 different individuals had visited the site since his discovery. The hiker documented these changes with his camera, capturing high-resolution images from his concealed position. Only after 20 minutes of observation, with no signs of human presence, did he finally step into the clearing, moving laterally rather than directly toward the disc, maintaining maximum distance while completing his circumferential documentation. The metal disc itself had changed. The symbols etched around its perimeter, which had briefly illuminated at his touch days earlier, now emitted a faint but persistent phosphorescence visible even in daylight. More significantly, the disc appeared to have emerged further from the soil, as though gradually rising toward the surface. The hiker activated his GPS device, marking waypoints and recording observational notes via whispered voice memo. The radiation detector remained reassuringly quiet, but a handheld atmospheric analyzer showed elevated levels of several compounds not typically present in forest environments. With growing unease but professional determination, he approached the disc directly, setting up a compact tripod with his camera to document any changes or reactions. From his pack, he removed sterile collection tools and fresh sample containers, intending to gather additional soil and possibly a scraping from the disc itself. As he knelt beside the object, the strange atmospheric pressure he'd noted on his first visit intensified, creating a sensation of weight against his ears and sinuses. The silence deepened until even his breathing seemed muffled, as though sound itself was being absorbed by the surrounding air. The hiker reached toward the disc with gloved hands, a steel scraper poised to collect a sample from the metallic surface. The moment the tool contacted the edge of the disc, a low vibration passed through the ground beneath him. not violent like an earthquake but rhythmic, almost mechanical. He withdrew quickly, but the vibration continued, gradually increasing in intensity. The symbols around the disc's perimeter brightened, their glow pulsing in synchronization with the tremors. Most alarming was the movement of the disc itself, which began to rotate slowly counterclockwise, soil falling away as it emerged further from the ground. The hiker backed away, camera recording continuously as the impossible unfolded before him. The disc, now revealed to be much larger than initially apparent, continued its emergence. Not a simple plate or hatch, but the top of a cylindrical structure at least 6 feet in diameter. As it rose, additional bands of symbols became visible along its curved surface, each illuminating in sequence from top to bottom. The surrounding vegetation flattened in an expanding circle, pressed down by an invisible force radiating from the rising object. The hiker maintained his documentation despite his mounting fear, narrating observations into his voice recorder as he retreated toward the tree line. Cylindrical structure continuing to emerge, approximately 8 feet exposed now. No visible seams or access points. Symbols consistent with those initially observed but forming more complex patterns. Ground vibrations increasing. His description halted abruptly as the top of the cylinder suddenly split into triangular sections that folded outward like the petals of a mechanical flower. Bright light, too pure, too white to be natural, spilled from the opening, casting harsh shadows across the clearing. The hiker raised his arm to shield his eyes, still filming with his other hand. Through squinted vision, he could see into the open cylinder. Not a solid structure, but a shaft descending into darkness, its walls lined with the same illuminated symbols. Metal rungs formed a ladder down one side, disappearing into depths that should not exist in the natural geology of the area. Transfixed by the revelation, the hiker almost missed the movement at the far side of the clearing. 3 figures had emerged from the forest opposite his position, dressed in matte black tactical gear without identifying insignia. Their faces were obscured by full-face respirators and dark visors. 2 carried what appeared to be specialized scientific equipment. The third held a weapon unmistakably directed toward him. The hiker dropped instinctively, his training in wilderness survival translating effectively to this entirely different threat. He scrambled backward into the underbrush, abandoning the tripod but clutching his camera and sample bag as he sought cover behind a massive fallen tree trunk. Voices carried across the clearing, terse and professional. Site compromised. Subject identified. Initiate containment protocol. The absolute certainty that these individuals meant him harm galvanized the hiker into action. Keeping low, he began moving through the forest undergrowth, away from both the figures and the illuminated shaft. His knowledge of the terrain provided critical advantage. He knew the ravine system to the east offered both cover and multiple exit routes that wouldn't appear on standard maps. Behind him, shouts indicated his retreat had been spotted. The crack of a gunshot followed, the bullet splintering bark from a tree several feet to his right. Not a miss, but a warning, he realized. They wanted him alive. The hiker abandoned stealth for speed, rising to a crouching run as he navigated between trees and overfallen logs. His boots found purchase on the forest floor with practiced certainty, decades of hiking experience translated into survival movement. He angled toward a steep slope that would lead to the ravine, knowing the descent would be treacherous but unlikely to be anticipated by his pursuers. The sounds of pursuit grew more distant as he widened the gap, his superior knowledge of the terrain creating crucial separation. At the ravine edge, he paused only long enough to secure his documentation equipment before half-sliding, half-climbing down the nearly vertical earth embankment, using exposed roots and rocks as handholds. At the bottom, he crossed the small stream without hesitation, the cold water soaking his boots as he pushed through to the opposite side and began the ascent. Only when he reached the top of the far side did he pause to orient himself, consulting his GPS unit to confirm the most efficient route back to civilization, while avoiding main trails and potential interception points. For nearly 2 hours, the hiker moved through the forest in a grueling combination of speed hiking and careful concealment, changing direction frequently and using natural features to obscure his trail. Twice he heard distant voices and once the mechanical whine of what might have been a drone, but the sounds faded without indication he'd been spotted. By late afternoon, he had reached the periphery of the forest where it bordered agricultural land. Exhausted but driven by adrenaline, he skirted field edges and property boundaries until reaching a rural access road nearly 5 miles from his original entry point. The road led to a small gas station and convenience store where the hiker, disheveled and mud-stained, purchased water and used the public restroom to clean up sufficiently to avoid alarming other customers. From the store's parking lot, he called another rideshare service to transport him to the shopping mall where he'd left his vehicle. Throughout the tense ride, the hiker maintained casual conversation with the driver while continuously scanning for signs of pursuit. Only after confirming his vehicle remained untampered with did he finally allow himself a moment of relief, sitting in the driver's seat with doors locked as he transferred his documentation to secure storage and checked that all his samples remained intact. The rendezvous with the environmental journalist was scheduled for 7:00 p.m. at a franchise restaurant located in a busy shopping district 30 miles from the forest. The hiker arrived 90 minutes early, parking at an adjacent grocery store and observing the location before approaching on foot, entering through a secondary door that offered clear views of the entire dining area. The journalist was already there, seated at a corner table with visibility of both main entrance and emergency exit. In her early 50s, with steel-gray hair cut in a practical bob, she projected an air of relaxed alertness that came from decades investigating corporate pollution scandals and government environmental cover-ups. She acknowledged the hiker with nothing more than a slight nod as he approached and took the seat opposite her. "You look like you've had an interesting day," she observed quietly, pushing a menu toward him as cover for their conversation. "That's one word for it," the hiker replied, his voice hoarse from exertion and stress. "Did you review what I sent you? Enough to understand why we're meeting." She sipped her water, eyes continuously scanning the restaurant. "You mentioned new developments?" "Beyond what I could have imagined." The hiker described his return to the site and the incredible emergence of the cylindrical shaft, followed by the appearance of the armed figures and his subsequent pursuit through the forest. The journalist listened without interruption, her expression remaining neutral though her eyes sharpened at key details. When he finished, she nodded once, decisively. "Show me," she said simply. The hiker connected a memory card to his phone, keeping the device below table level as he displayed the images and video he'd captured. The journalist's composure slipped only once, when the footage showed the cylinder opening to reveal the descending shaft. A sharp intake of breath quickly controlled. "This changes everything," she murmured, returning the phone. "We need to move quickly. I have contacts at 3 national news organizations and a senior investigator with the Environmental Protection Agency who isn't compromised. But distribution needs to be simultaneous and overwhelming. Whoever these people are, they have resources to suppress isolated reports." The hiker produced a small package containing duplicate storage devices and soil samples. "Everything's here, including chain of custody documentation for the samples. The full video is too large to transfer now, but it's uploading to a secure server as we speak." The journalist accepted the package, securing it in an inside pocket of her jacket. "I'll have preliminary reports ready for release by morning. Full coverage within 24 hours. Major outlets, international distribution, simultaneous social media deployment. Once it breaks, there's no putting it back in the box." "And if something happens to you?" the hiker asked quietly. "Dead man switches just like yours." The journalist's smile was grim. "I've been doing this for 27 years. These precautions became standard after my second death threat." They finalized details for secure communication over the next critical days, then departed separately, the journalist leaving first while the hiker remained to order and consume a meal he barely tasted, maintaining the appearance of an ordinary diner. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of tension and vigilance. The hiker relocated to a budget motel paid for with cash, registered under a plausible alias. He maintained communication blackout except for brief, coded check-ins with the journalist using the prepaid phones, which they discarded and replaced daily as a precaution. On the morning of the 3rd day, he awoke to breaking news alerts on every channel. The journalist had delivered as promised. Multiple major news organizations simultaneously published detailed exposés on classified underground structure discovered in national forest. The reports included selected images and video from his documentation, expert analysis of the symbols and technology, and connections to the historical Project Elmwood records. By mid-morning, the story had exploded across all media platforms. Helicopter footage showed a massive operation underway at the forest site, with military and civilian vehicles forming a perimeter around the clearing. Government spokespersons issued carefully worded statements acknowledging an ongoing investigation into previously decommissioned research facilities, while neither confirming nor denying the specific details in the reports. Social media amplified the story exponentially, with the hashtag #ForestDiscovery trending globally. The journalists' careful packaging of the evidence, presented as an environmental and public safety concern rather than a conspiracy theory, garnered attention from serious news analysts and government oversight committees. By evening, the governor had issued a statement announcing a joint task force with federal agencies to investigate potential environmental hazards and historical negligence. Congressional representatives from the state demanded briefings on the nature of Project Elmwood and any continuing operations in their jurisdiction. The hiker observed it all from his motel room, emotions cycling between vindication, relief, and lingering apprehension. The journalist's strategy had worked. The story had become too big, too public to be quietly suppressed. Whatever secrets lay at the bottom of that illuminated shaft would now be examined under the harsh light of public scrutiny. A week later, the hiker stood on a distant hillside overlooking the forest clearing, now transformed into what resembled a scientific research camp combined with a military installation. Multiple large tents surrounded the site where the cylindrical shaft had emerged. Heavy equipment and mobile laboratories had been transported in via hastily constructed access roads. The perimeter bristled with security measures, fencing, surveillance equipment, and armed personnel. Through binoculars, he observed teams of people in specialized protective gear entering and exiting the primary structure. Some carried equipment, others emerged with containers similar to those used for hazardous material transport. Whatever they were finding down there, it involved extensive documentation and careful handling. The journalist had maintained contact, sharing information from her sources within the EPA and other agencies. The official story continued to evolve, from initial denials to acknowledgement of a decommissioned Cold War research facility, to vague admissions about unusual geological phenomena that had been monitored since the 1950s. What remained unaddressed in all official communications were the illuminated symbols, the technology that had preserved the structure for decades, and the nature of the armed response team that had pursued him through the forest. Those elements appeared in speculative reporting and eyewitness accounts, but were conspicuously absent from government statements. The hiker's identity remained protected. The journalist had been careful to anonymize him as an experienced environmental consultant in all reporting. Still, he had taken extended leave from his consulting position and relocated temporarily to a rental cabin nearly 100 miles from his home, a precaution that seemed prudent given the scale of what he had exposed. As twilight descended over the distant operation, the hiker lowered his binoculars and prepared to depart. He had accomplished what he set out to do, uncovered the truth and ensured it couldn't be reburied. The public demand for answers continued to grow rather than diminish as days passed, with environmental activists, scientific organizations, and political oversight committees all demanding transparency. Whatever the full truth about Project Elmwood and the illuminated shaft might be, it no longer rested solely in the hands of those who had pursued him through the forest. The silent discovery had found its voice, amplified by media and public interest beyond any possibility of renewed concealment. The hiker took one last photograph of the distant operation, then turned away from the overlook. His own journey with this mystery wasn't over. He had agreed to serve as a confidential consultant for the independent investigation being assembled by a consortium of universities and environmental organizations. His expertise and first-hand observations would help guide their research, while allowing him to monitor the official narrative for discrepancies or attempted cover-ups. As he hiked back to his vehicle in the gathering darkness, he reflected on how a simple decision to take a shortcut through the woods had cascaded into a revelation that would likely reshape scientific understanding and governmental transparency. The full implications remained unknown, but one thing was certain: the silent forest would never again successfully hide its secrets. 6 months passed. Winter had descended upon the region, blanketing the forest in pristine white that concealed the scars of intensive operations at the discovery site. From the hillside overlook that had become his regular observation point, the hiker watched as the activity around the underground structure had gradually transitioned from emergency response to methodical research. The hastily erected perimeter now replaced with permanent facilities bearing government insignia. The truth had emerged in measured stages, each revelation more disturbing than the last. What had begun as speculation about environmental contamination or abandoned military research had evolved into something far darker: a documented history of human experimentation conducted under the guise of national security. The congressional hearings, broadcast live across all major networks, had laid bare the horrifying reality of Project Elmwood. Beginning in the early 1950s, the facility had served as a black site for testing experimental treatments on unwitting subjects, primarily patients from state psychiatric institutions, homeless veterans, and individuals from marginalized communities who had disappeared without investigation. The retired supervisor's cryptic warning about the monitoring protocols and why no one ever visited the site alone now made terrible sense. The geological anomalies and atmospheric research had been convenient covers for a program studying the long-term effects of chemical and radiological exposures on human subjects kept in underground containment cells. Most disturbing were the records recovered from the sealed lower levels of the facility. Meticulous documentation spanning decades, detailing the progression of symptoms, physiological changes, and psychological deterioration of hundreds of individuals. The researchers' notes, clinical and dispassionate, charted suffering with scientific precision while treating human beings as laboratory specimens. The metallic shaft the hiker had documented opening was just the emergency access point to a much larger complex extending nearly 6 stories underground. The main facility, accessible through a separate entrance that had been concealed within a decommissioned ranger station 3 miles away, contained laboratories, observation rooms, and containment cells where subjects had been housed for years, sometimes decades. The illuminated symbols that had so puzzled the hiker turned out to be a sophisticated warning system designed to activate when the containment protocols were compromised. The system had been triggered by his initial contact with the access hatch, initiating an automated emergency sequence that had been programmed but never expected to execute after the facility's official closure. The most shocking discovery, revealed during the 3rd week of the hearings, was that Project Elmwood had never truly been decommissioned. While the original research program had officially ended in 1967, a skeleton crew of personnel continued maintaining the facility and monitoring the surviving subjects well into the 1990s. The quarterly inspections the retired supervisor had mentioned were merely the visible portion of ongoing operations, designed to maintain the illusion of proper decommissioning while the true activities continued underground. The final subjects had died in 1997, according to recovered records, but the facility had been preserved intact, ostensibly for potential research value, but more likely to conceal evidence of crimes against humanity. The automated systems had continued functioning for decades, powered by an independent nuclear battery designed for long-term operation. The human cost was staggering. Documentation confirmed 437 individuals had been processed through the facility over its operational history. None had survived. None had provided informed consent. Most had families who never learned their fates, with official records showing false death certificates citing natural causes or institutional accidents. The congressional investigation had expanded beyond Project Elmwood to identify similar sites across the country, a network of black research facilities operating outside proper oversight or ethical constraints. Arrests followed as surviving administrators and researchers were identified through the meticulous records kept by the very bureaucracy that had enabled their crimes. The former defense secretary, now in his 90s, appeared before the committee with oxygen tubes in his nostrils, offering neither denial nor apology for his department's role in establishing the program. National security imperatives of that era required difficult decisions, he stated, his voice reedy but defiant. History will judge our actions in proper context. History's judgment came swiftly. The committee chair's response became the defining soundbite of the proceedings. The systematic torture and murder of American citizens can never be justified by national security. This wasn't science, it was sadism wearing a lab coat. For the communities surrounding the forest, the revelations brought a complex mixture of horror, vindication, and grief. Local stories of strange occurrences and unexplained disappearances, long dismissed as rural superstition, were suddenly recontextualized as potential evidence. Families who had lost members decades earlier came forward with photographs and personal histories, seeking to determine if their loved ones had been among the victims. A DNA identification program was established to match remains recovered from the facility's crematorium, with family members searching for closure. The matches confirmed the facility's preference for targeting those least protected by society, the poor, the mentally ill, racial minorities, and those without close family connections. National attention remained fixed on the unfolding story even as the initial shock faded into grim acceptance. The journalist's carefully constructed narrative had prevented the typical cycle of sensationalism followed by disinterest. By focusing on the human stories of the victims and the systematic governmental failures that enabled their suffering, she had transformed what might have been a temporary scandal into a sustained demand for accountability. International reaction had been equally significant. United Nations human rights investigators requested access to the facility and recovered records. Allied governments launched investigations into whether similar programs had operated within their borders through cooperative intelligence arrangements. The revelations damaged American moral standing in ways that would take generations to repair. Through it all, the hiker had maintained his anonymity, identified in official proceedings only as the environmental consultant, whose discovery had exposed the long-buried crimes. The journalist had carefully managed his public identity, understanding that the powerful interests implicated in the Project Elmwood revelations might seek retribution despite the congressional spotlight. That anonymity ended on a crisp February morning when a formal invitation arrived requesting his presence at a White House ceremony recognizing exceptional civilian service to the nation. After careful consideration and consultation with the journalist, who had become both colleague and friend through their shared experience, the hiker accepted. The East Room of the White House presented a stark contrast to the forest clearing where his journey had begun. Ornate chandeliers and historical paintings surrounded a gathering of political leaders, agency officials, and family representatives of confirmed Project Elmwood victims. The hiker, uncomfortable in his rented suit but steady in his purpose, stood quietly at the edge of the assembled crowd as the president approached the podium. Today, we recognize an individual whose courage and persistence exposed one of the darkest chapters in our nation's history, the president began, voice solemn. In doing so, we also acknowledge a profound failure of government to uphold its most sacred obligation, protecting its citizens from harm. The president continued, outlining the scope of the Project Elmwood revelations and the subsequent reforms being implemented. New oversight mechanisms for classified research, independent monitoring of all government facilities, enhanced whistleblower protections, and a victim compensation fund for families of those affected. While we cannot undo the suffering inflicted in our nation's name, we can ensure it is never forgotten and never repeated, the president said, gesturing toward the hiker. Please join me in recognizing the environmental consultant whose active citizenship revealed truths that powerful interests sought to keep buried forever. The applause that followed was subdued, appropriate to the solemn nature of the recognition. The hiker approached the podium with reluctance, uncomfortable with the attention but understanding the symbolic importance of the moment. He had prepared brief remarks, focused not on his actions, but on the systemic failures that had allowed Project Elmwood to exist. Thank you, Mr. President. This recognition belongs not to me, but to the 437 individuals whose lives were taken at Project Elmwood, and to countless others at similar facilities whose stories remain untold. He began, his voice steady despite his discomfort with public speaking. What happened in that forest represents not just the cruelty of specific individuals, but the danger of systems operating without transparency or accountability. When government agencies believe they can act in darkness, without oversight or ethical constraints, humanity itself becomes secondary to abstract notions of security or progress. He paused, looking across the assembled faces, political leaders, military officials, agency directors, many of whom represented the very institutions implicated in the abuses. The true measure of our response to these revelations will not be in ceremonies or speeches, but in the structural changes we implement to prevent similar abuses. Not just new policies that can be reversed by future administrations, but fundamental reforms that make it impossible for such programs to exist in shadows beyond public accountability. The hiker concluded by recognizing the families of victims, the congressional investigators who had pursued truth despite political pressure, and the journalist whose expertise had transformed isolated evidence into irrefutable public record. He made no mention of the threats he had faced or the personal cost of his involvement. Those details remained private despite their significance to his experience. After the ceremony, he spoke briefly with several family representatives who had traveled to Washington seeking closure for loved ones lost decades earlier. Their stories, of young men who enlisted and never returned, of sisters taken from psychiatric facilities for specialized treatment, of fathers who disappeared while traveling for work, weighed on him more heavily than any recognition or accolade could lift. We spent 40 years not knowing, an elderly woman told him, clutching a photograph of a young man in a military uniform. Even with this pain, knowing is better than wondering. Thank you for that gift. By evening, the hiker had exchanged his suit for more comfortable clothing and sat alone in his hotel room, watching news coverage of the ceremony while organizing his thoughts in a journal he had maintained since the discovery. The process of documenting his experiences had become therapeutic, transforming chaotic emotions into structured narrative that he could examine with professional detachment. He wrote about the cost of involvement, the career disruption, the lingering hypervigilance. The way ordinary forest sounds now triggered an alertness bordering on anxiety. He acknowledged the nightmares that still occasionally woke him, visions of underground chambers and the faces of those who had suffered there, people he had never met but whose stories he now carried. Yet alongside these burdens, he documented growth and purpose. His environmental consulting practice had evolved to focus specifically on identifying and addressing corporate and governmental contamination in disadvantaged communities, those least likely to have their concerns taken seriously by regulatory agencies. The skills that had enabled his investigation of Project Elmwood now served communities facing similar, if less dramatic, institutional neglect. 3 weeks after the White House ceremony, the hiker returned to the forest for the first time since his desperate escape months earlier. The official investigation had concluded, the temporary structures dismantled, the site now marked only by discreet monitoring equipment and memorial markers placed at the entrance to what had been designated a National Historic Site commemorating the victims. The hiker bypassed the official entrance, instead approaching from the same trail where his journey had begun. The forest felt different now, its silence no longer ominous but respectful, as though the land itself acknowledged the suffering that had occurred beneath its surface. Spring had not yet arrived, but scattered wildflowers pushed through the remaining snow, life persisting despite the darkness in the soil below. The clearing had been transformed. The open shaft was now permanently sealed with a concrete cap, but in place of the mysterious metal disc stood a simple monument, a circular stone platform inset with 437 small bronze squares, each bearing only a case number and recovered name when available. Many remained listed as unknown, their identities lost to history despite the ongoing identification efforts. The hiker stood at the edge of the memorial, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. He had brought no flowers or conventional tokens of remembrance. Instead, he carried a small container of native plant seeds, species that would gradually spread throughout the clearing, transforming a place of death into one of renewed life. As he scattered the seeds across the recently disturbed soil surrounding the monument, he reflected on the incomplete nature of justice. The congressional investigations continued, and several high-ranking officials awaited trial for their roles in concealing evidence. Yet many of those most directly responsible had died years earlier, never facing accountability for their actions. The victims remained dead, their suffering undiminished by posthumous recognition. What had been accomplished, he realized, was not restoration, but revelation, the exposure of truth that might prevent similar abuses in the future, not through good intentions or promises of reform, but through the lasting public awareness that made it harder for such programs to operate beyond scrutiny. After completing his planting, the hiker sat on a fallen log at the clearing's edge, opening his journal to record final observations of the site. In the quiet, he became aware of subtle sounds returning to the forest around him, birdsong in the distance, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, life reclaiming space that had long been avoided. The hiker remained until twilight, watching as security lights automatically illuminated the memorial area. As darkness descended, he noticed something unexpected, the faintest blue luminescence emanating from beneath the concrete cap, visible only in the growing darkness. A remnant of the facility's warning system perhaps, or something else entirely that the investigation had failed to fully neutralize. He documented this final observation in his journal, adding it to the collection of lingering questions that might never be fully answered. The true extent of research conducted at Project Elmwood, the full purpose of the strange symbols, the nature of the automated systems that had maintained the facility for decades after its supposed decommissioning, these mysteries remained despite months of intensive investigation. As he hiked back toward the trailhead in growing darkness, guided by the familiar weight of his headlamp, the hiker reflected on how a simple decision to take a shortcut had altered not only his life, but national understanding of historical injustice. There had been nothing special about him that made him the one to make this discovery, just circumstance, curiosity, and a willingness to pursue truth despite increasing personal risk. That, perhaps, was the most important lesson of his experience. Not that terrible things happened in darkness, which humanity had always known, but that ordinary individuals carrying truth into light could force even the most powerful institutions to acknowledge reality. The system's failure had been exposed not by its enemies but by someone who simply believed it should function as promised, protecting people rather than power. 6 months later, the journalist's comprehensive book on Project Elmwood and similar facilities was published to critical acclaim and public attention that reignited congressional oversight hearings. The hiker, identified only by his profession, featured prominently in early chapters but receded from the narrative as institutional failures and victims' stories took center stage, exactly as he had requested. On the 1-year anniversary of his discovery, the hiker returned once more to the forest clearing. The memorial had been enhanced with educational placards detailing the history of Project Elmwood and the broader context of unethical human experimentation in American history. The native plants he had seeded had established themselves around the monument, wildflowers and grasses softening the harsh edges of human construction. As the hiker completed his circuit of the memorial, reading each victim's name where available, he noticed a small group approaching along the main trail, family members coming to remember loved ones lost to the facility's cruelty. He nodded respectfully as they passed but maintained distance, allowing them private space for their remembrance. From the edge of the clearing, he watched as they placed photographs and personal items on the memorial stones corresponding to their family members. Their quiet conversations and occasional embraces demonstrated a different kind of healing, not the false comfort of ignorance, but the painful truth that allowed genuine mourning to finally begin. The hiker departed as quietly as he had arrived, leaving the families to their remembrance. The forest path seemed different now, permanently altered by knowledge that could not be unlearned. Yet as he walked, he noticed details he had missed during his original discovery: the specific patterns of lichen on stone, the unique configuration of branches against sky, the subtle harmonies of wind through leaves. The truth about Project Elmwood had not made the world simpler or safer. If anything, it had revealed additional layers of complexity and potential darkness. Yet it had also demonstrated that persistent investigation could penetrate even the most carefully constructed secrecy, that documentation could overcome denial, that individual action could catalyze institutional accountability. The hiker emerged from the forest trail into the now expanded parking area, where informational signs directed visitors to the memorial site. He paused at the trailhead, looking back at the path that had changed his understanding of both human cruelty and resilience. The forest would always carry the shadows of what had happened beneath its surface, just as the nation would always bear the responsibility for sanctioning such abuses. Yet both continued forward, neither defined solely by their darkest chapters nor absolved by acknowledgement alone. As he turned toward his vehicle, the hiker noticed a small group gathering near the visitor center. Young environmental activists preparing to document potential contamination at a corporate facility several counties away. Their equipment, determination, and sense of purpose mirrored his own approach from a year earlier. The cycle continued. Ordinary individuals questioning, investigating, documenting, revealing. Not because they sought recognition or reward, but because truth itself held value worth pursuing, especially when powerful interests preferred it remain hidden. In that continuing pursuit, the hiker had found, if not peace, then purpose, one that would guide his remaining years with the same quiet determination that had led him down an unmarked path and into unexpected darkness, where he had found not only horror, but the enduring importance of bringing what was buried into light. Don't forget to subscribe for more gripping investigative stories that expose the hidden truths beneath everyday places. Hit that notification bell to be the first to know when our next shocking discovery goes live.